We should have the freedom to be political people, the freedom to go for a walk, freedom to do a million things. That's a pursuit of life. Where's the plan for that? Is the Romanian? No, Romanian government is obsessed. Security, security, security.
We love the fact that you love freedom.
Welcome to another episode of our series on infrastructures. Today we talk about the connection between the economy and militarization in Europe, about infrastructures as a tool for foreign policy or an instrument to further the interest of big capital. And we will talk about many other things which surely will pop up more or less spontaneously during our conversation. And we know this for sure because our guest today is Vijay Prashad, who, in our view, knows to connect the dots, especially those which usually remain unseen and undiscussed. We structure the conversation into parts, so don't hesitate to follow us for the whole talk.
Vijay is an Indian historian and journalist. He is the author of 40 books, including Washington Bullets, Red Star Over the Third World, The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, The Poorer Nations, A Possible History of the Global South and the Withdrawal, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and the Fragility of US Power, written with Noam Chomsky. Vijay is the executive director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, the chief correspondent for Globetrotter, and the chief editor of Leftward Books in New Delhi. He also appeared in the films Shadow World and Two Meetings. Welcome, Vijay. Vijay, there is this widespread view in Eastern Europe that the European Union is an economic union created apart from stimulating economic growth precisely to avoid the war. In schools and universities, there is always this story told about how the economic treaties after World War II were signed with this purpose in mind, to make a Third World War impossible. I refer here to the Coal and Steel Treaty of 1952 and the subsequent treaties. In fact, one might argue that what appealed to the people in Romania and other Eastern European countries after the fall of the socialist regimes was, beside the promise of a better life, this alleged pacifist orientation of the European Union. Now we see how in the last 2 years the German chancellor was forced by the US to change Germany's energy policy basically overnight. We see how the EU countries are pressed to spend more and more on US-made weapons, how Ukraine is promised the EU accession on the condition it continues fighting, and so on. In short, we see that not only NATO but also the European Union is directly enforcing militaristic policies. Looking at these political decisions, what is the difference today between NATO and the European Union?
Yeah, it's really great to be with you. I've been thinking a lot about Romania in anticipation of our conversation, of all the Eastern European countries and the way in which, in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the communist state system and of the Soviet Union, how so many of the Eastern European countries were brought into a kind of European project. That, by the way, was not inevitable. They could very well have created their own project. They could have gone in a different direction. There was nothing inevitable about, let's say, the Balkan countries or the countries up in, Latvia, Estonia, and so on, joining Europe. These are not obvious things. I just want to emphasize that Europe is a very recent imaginary construction. It's not something that is rooted in either geography or in history. I mean, these parts of the world, many of them were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, some in the Ottoman Empire, some looked to Asia rather than towards, say, France. So when these countries in the 1990s began to be drawn into the European project, there were really two platforms that drew them in. One was the platform which is the older platform and is the infrastructure of Europe, and that's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. set up in 1949. And then related to that is the European Union. I mean, the relationship between NATO and the European Union is a fundamental issue. When you say countries in Eastern Europe began to look westward, now we'll integrate into Europe. What were they integrating into? Were they genuinely integrating into a common market? Was that good for the people in Eastern Europe? Was that going to increase the possibilities in economic terms for people? Would migration of people from Eastern Europe to, let's say, France, Germany, increase their possibilities in life and so on? These are real questions. But underneath that is the more fundamental integration, which was the integration into the military pact, one way or the other, whether as partner states with NATO or joining NATO as full scale members. Now, it got to the stage, you will remember, in the 1990s when Boris Yeltsin wanted Russia to join NATO. Then you wonder, what is the point of NATO if the old adversaries are joining together in this military alliance? Who are they in a military alliance against? Who are they training to go to war against? At the time, it was not very clear. There were some so-called rogue states, whether the Democratic People's Republic of Korea or North Korea, Cuba, and so on. A handful of countries were called by U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Anthony Lake, and then National Security Advisor Anthony Lake defined this category rogue states and said, "This is our adversary." I mean, were Eastern European countries joining NATO to get into a war against North Korea? I don't think this was on the cards. I think what was on the cards, that the price of admission into Europe was the military alliance. That was the price of admission. If you entered the military alliance, then maybe you could get some of the economic benefits. And what this military alliance is, and here's the main point, the military alliance isn't a military alliance merely against North Korea or later against China. That's not the point of it. The military alliance is a way to politically subordinate countries to US policy. The United States uses NATO to subordinate the European allies that it has. And when the US says, for instance, increase defense spending to 2%, United States is actually intervening in the sovereign decisions of countries in Europe through NATO, rather than through the European Union directly. It's NATO that's the discipliner for US hegemony over Europe. And so I think when Eastern European countries said, "Oh, let's join Europe," people may have been thinking about, the open market. We can get access to jobs in other countries. We can travel without a visa and so on. That's what they may have been thinking. But in fact, because the price of admission was a military alliance, they subordinated their sovereignty effectively to the United States. And so that's really the link between NATO and the European Union, in my opinion.
In this line, Vijay, we have prepared a question only that it has a long introduction, so bear with us. This is a short diagram of how NATO is structured in Romania. Currently, there are 9 NATO bases here. More than 5,500 NATO soldiers are stationed in the country, of which around 2,000 are US American soldiers. The biggest NATO base, Real Base 57 in Mihail Kogălnicianu, is located in the southeast of the country, just 20 kilometers away from the Black Sea coast and 100 kilometers away from the Ukrainian border. The Aerial Base 57 has a squadron of F-16 jets, recently bought from Norway, as well as MQ-9 Reaper drones, and a military city through which NATO Army, Air Force and naval personnel from 32 countries will rotate. The Romanian government wants to allocate $2.7 billion for the enlargement of this base, so that will accommodate 10,000 soldiers and their families, becoming by 2014 the biggest aerial NATO base in Europe. Bigger even than Ramstein in Germany now. Closer to Bucharest, there is a aerial base 86 at Fetești, where the European F-16 training center has been operating since the fall last year, established with the aim of training Ukrainian pilots to use aircrafts of this type. Last week, the Romanian Ministry of Defense published a bill declaring its intention to purchase 48 F-35 flight jets manufactured by Lockheed Martin Corporation in Maryland, USA, of which the first installment for the 32 jets amounts $6.5 billion. Well, the money will be paid either directly by the Romanian government or through US loans. Just today, as we speak, as we have the interview on the 2nd of September, the Romanian government has sent to the parliament a bill by which it agrees to donate one Patriot defense system to Ukraine. Romania would receive in exchange another Patriot system from the United States, but for now it is not clear when this will happen. Along with the militarization in the European Union, the Romanian economy is slowly aligning towards a war economy. The Recovery and Resilience Funds aim, among other things, to reconstruct the public socialist network in order to connect the northeast part of Romania, neighboring Ukraine, Black Sea and Republic of Moldova, with the western part of Romania, neighboring Hungary. The Black Sea region sees a full-blown development in terms of transport infrastructure and logistic hubs. Through Neptune deep exploitations and the Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary and Austria gas corridor, Romania aims to become the biggest provider of this fossil fuel in the EU. This summer, the Romanian government began negotiations for the purchase of a strategic port on the Danube River, Giurgiulești, situated at the border between Ukraine and the Republic of Moldova. Romania aims to be an important logistic center for the reconstruction of Ukraine. The Minister of Economy said this year, geography is on our side. At the same time, according to Eurostat, a third of the Romanian population is at risk of poverty or social exclusion, this share being the highest reported in the EU last year. Among those who are employed, 2 of 10 are in poverty. All these transformations are pushed forth by a political elite that continues the violent privatization of the few remaining state companies, such as Tarom Flight Company, that's been talked about selling to Qatar Airways. This elite shows no restraint in using public money for the development of different private interests and gives the floor for the coming presidential elections this autumn to a range of candidates, all Christian nationalists, among them the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, a retired General Army colonel who participated in operations in Afghanistan, Bosnia and Herzegovina and Iraq, and candidates on the far-right parties. Now, in your view, how safe and secure is this population in Romania and in the neighboring countries?
I mean, firstly, I would be very cautious if I were a Romanian national about these bases and the expansion of the bases. You know, Romania has an interesting history. In the late 1950s, Romania actually put forward the idea for building a Balkan nuclear zone of peace. People may not know this concept of a nuclear zone of peace. The idea is that a bunch of countries come together and they say that in our countries we don't want nuclear weapons to be stationed. So, for instance, there's the Treaty of Rarotonga, which says that no nuclear weapons in the South Pacific, nuclear weapons free zone in the 1950s, a very important part of Romania's history, and should be revived and talked about. I think this idea of the Balkan nuclear weapons free zone. I'm not sure if there's a living memory of this. And I know that after the first proposal by the Romanian government, there were several attempts to build a Balkan nuclear weapons free zone. I know that Yugoslavia had been interested in the idea as well for very obvious reasons. So, I mean, I feel like if you consider that, you know, there is no Balkan nuclear weapons free zone, and I can come back to why this is itself not an immunity. there is likelihood if a country like Romania bordering Ukraine has F-16s that you said came from Norway. There are military bases being set up larger, you said, than Ramstein. I mean, that's chilling because the next step is that Romania becomes a hub for US nuclear missiles. In other words, Romania gets drawn into a project which was talked about in the last NATO meeting, where Germany agreed to house mid range US nuclear missiles. I mean, or nuclear capable missiles. This is a very disturbing possibility. And let me just go to Australia to come back to Romania. In Australia, in northern Australia, there is a city called Darwin, named after Charles Darwin. There's a US military base in Darwin, Australia, with a runway. The idea in Darwin has been to expand that runway. So the Australian government is paying for the expansion. Why are they expanding the runway in Australia? They are expanding the runway principally to house US, B-52 and other large long distance bombers, which are nuclear weapons capable. So now there is a worry among certain people in Australia that the United States wants to station nuclear weapons in northern Australia in order to have them within striking distance of China. And this is despite the fact that Australia is a member of the Treaty of Rarotonga, of a nuclear free zone. So, as I said, the nuclear free zone treaty itself is not an immunity, but it does help start a conversation. Come back to Europe and Romania. It's important to understand that this debate about US mid range nuclear missiles goes back to the 1960s and 1970s. Particularly in the 1970s, there was a very large movement around Europe, rooted initially in the United Kingdom, where the United States was going to put mid range nuclear missiles. There was a large movement across Europe against the deployment of US nuclear missiles in Europe. This was the beginning of the campaign for nuclear disarmament, the idea of nuclear freeze, and so on. Mass movements, very large numbers of people in Western Europe, they didn't want nuclear missiles, was nuclear missiles, rather than, especially mid range missiles, rather than creating detente or security, in fact, attract war. Because if you have a nuclear missile, mid range missile in your country, it is likely that somebody who feels threatened by it might start a war to help to try to get you to disarm. For instance, I believe that the Russians entered Ukraine not merely because of the problems in the Donbass region or to secure water supplies for the Crimea. I don't believe that that's the principal reason why Russia entered. I think the principal reason why Russia entered Ukraine, and in fact, the Russians have been saying this, is that they worried that the United States, which had walked out of the intermediate nuclear missile treaty, the INF treaty, Mr. Trump walked out of that treaty unilaterally in 2019, the treaty that had been negotiated between the US and the USSR painstakingly and had been renewed every few years. Trump walked out of that unilaterally, and the Russians feared that the US was going to place nuclear weapons, mid-range weapons in Ukraine, if not in the Baltic states. They worried about Ukraine. There had already been a conversation about that, and if they had placed mid-range nuclear missiles in Ukraine, would have been able to strike Moscow without really any kind of defense for the Russians. It was the great wow. If Romania is expanding military bases and Romania is going to start housing F-16s, and the next thing you hear is the runways are being expanded and you're going to get the big bombers, and then you're going to see a missile site set up. There is a possibility that in Moscow, they are going to start thinking Romania is going to be the site of US intermediate range nuclear missiles, and we are going to be aggressive against the Romanians. I mean, let me ask you a question. Is it possible to, if your government has said that geography is our advantage, is it possible to lift out Ukraine from where it exists on the planet Earth, lift out Romania from where it exists on the planet Earth, and deposit them in Iowa? Is it possible? Can the Romanians go and live in Iowa? No. The Romanians cannot be shifted wholesale to live next to the United States. They have to be proximate to their neighbors. They have neighbors in Hungary, neighbors in Serbia, neighbors in Ukraine. Ukraine has a neighbor with Russia. It has to come to terms with its neighborhood. In other words, Romania, Ukraine, Georgia have to have a security agreement with the Russians. That's the proximate large power. It makes no sense to become the distant battlefield for US contests with the Russians, and allow yourself to be put into a situation of insecurity. Romania is not a large country. You're going to have to come to terms with the fact that Russia is right next to you. And so I think it's true. Geography is important. You have to take it seriously. I think the minister who said that said something factual. It's true, but it's not necessarily an advantage the way they were talking about it. It could be a disadvantage if you become a land-based aircraft carrier for the United States. Then you actually don't have security, but you put yourself into greater insecurity. And let me say one final thing about this. Over the past 10 years, the United States has shown itself to be a most unreliable ally. Most unreliable ally. And don't take a word for it. Most unreliable ally. Talk to the people who relied upon the United States in Afghanistan. Talk to the people who relied upon the United States in Iraq. When the US went into Iraq, it created its own kind of US friendly Iraqis. And then they just abandoned them and left, just as they abandoned their friends among the Vietnamese population, the police officers and others who worked for the US government. They abandoned people in Afghanistan. We don't know what's happened to most of them. They didn't get visas to go to the US like the Vietnamese before them. They were stuck, many of them probably killed, if maybe arrested. Don't
True, Vijay,
think
but
that you can rely on the United States,
right,
because
but here I
you could
think
make an alliance, but it disappears. Yeah.
let me do the job of the devil's advocate, and and say yes, but Iraq or Afghanistan were no members of NATO, and I think this is what many people here in Eastern Europe would say. We are protected precisely because we are members of NATO members.
Well, that would be interesting to see, because thus far, NATO has operated largely following US interests. Let's take three examples. NATO attacked Yugoslavia when the United States saw it as beneficial to bomb Yugoslavia. Lots of people who looked at the breakup of Yugoslavia were not sure that NATO's intervention in 1999 came at a time to decrease bloodshed. In fact, it might have increased bloodshed. That's Yugoslavia. It was of the other NATO countries, let alone those that bordered, or not bordered, but were proximate to Yugoslavia. Second, let's take the case of Afghanistan. Why did NATO countries get involved in Afghanistan? Afghanistan is not even, in proximity to the North Atlantic. It's in Asia. Well, they got involved in Afghanistan because the United States wanted them to get involved in Afghanistan. The other area, operation against Libya, did it make sense, for NATO partners in Eastern Europe, for instance, or in Italy, to have Libya destroyed? That was something that the French and the United States wanted. That was not something that would be beneficial, particularly to countries that have a very good example on the table yet of the United States coming in defense of a NATO country. The NATO alliance has thus far been used, particularly out of area, when it has served U.S. interests. I can't even think of one example where the United States has agreed to come in defense of a NATO partner. So if the Romanians are willing to risk that, that's up to the Romanians. Let's see what happens. But personally, I think the examples of US overstating its own needs and understating the needs of its partners, that history is very strong, particularly in the current period. But yes, if the Romanians are willing to test the NATO treaty, and if they get into a conflict with a non NATO country, let's see how it goes. You might want to check with the Turks. You might want to check with the Turkish people and the Turkish government to see the benefits of the NATO treaty. And I'm saying this not facetiously, but during the campaign to overthrow the government in Syria, Turkey made an allegation that Syria had threatened Turkey, so Turkey crossed the border into Syria. You may remember this period when Turkish troops entered northern Syria. There was no question. There was actually not even a discussion among the NATO members about NATO getting involved in that war. That would have been the perfect casus belli. There was a bombing inside Turkey. Turkey decided to go into Syria. Where was NATO to defend Turkey? I'm not talking about the merits of whether a NATO ally like Turkey should have been assisted at the time. I'm just merely talking about, the treaty. The treaty says if a NATO country is attacked, all countries come to its defense. Well, the Turks said they were attacked and they crossed the border into Syria. I didn't see any American tanks coming with them. I didn't see any German tanks coming with them. Israel is not a NATO ally, for instance. And yet, almost 100% of the weapons coming to Israel now, coming from outside into Israel, are coming from NATO partners. The United States supplying 80% of Israel's weapons, and Germany supplying almost 20% of Israel's weapons. Evidence of the United States and Germany, two major NATO partners, supporting political allies, whereas there's a negative example of Turkey. So, again, if Romania is willing to test the NATO treaty, let's see. It's a good experiment. For me, it's a test, it's an experiment. For you, it's your actual lives. It's your lives that are at stake. Are you willing to put your lives at stake for a treaty that till now has been used to further US interests and not the interests of the other member nations of NATO or of the European alliance?
Yes, that's a question that we should address, in fact, to the Romanian government and to our ruling class. But let's move on and let us ask you a sort of a different question. There is a political consensus now around militarization all across Europe. We all remember what Stoltenberg last year said: weapons are the way to peace, at the conference at Davos. Now, between January 2022 and June 2024, 40 billion euros were sent by EU institutions to Ukraine as aid. An additional 15 billion were sent by Germany alone, the majority of which are weapons and military equipment. In fact, when you raise questions about this militaristic approach, you are immediately accused of being Putin's supporter or being on Russia's payroll. There is no room for a serious public debate about these matters. Mainstream media contributes to this and stifles any attempt at having this debate. Now, for us, it is quite strange to see these developments, because one thing that we thought to have won after the fall of the Berlin Wall was freedom of speech. Now there is no room for freedom of speech. We again face political censorship, which in a way is reminiscent of the Ceausescu era, at least in the Romanian context. We saw last week how a car with 3 journalists was bombed by a Turkish drone. The genocide in Gaza is one of the deadliest ever periods for journalists and non-Western media. Now, you have a long experience as a journalist, Vijay. What means do we have to confront this political consensus in the name of peace?
Yeah, I mean, how does one even enter this conversation about freedom of speech and so on? I mean, you're right. This is one of the enduring values, the self, expression of Europeanism. I mean, Europe has promoted itself, particularly in the reinvention after the Nazi Holocaust and World War II. It sort of reinvented itself around the concepts of human rights and freedom of speech. I mean, it was a remarkable reinvention. A continent bathed in the blood of its colonies suddenly comes out there and talks about itself as rights and of of the values of decency and so on. I mean, in fact, Europe, Holland, Belgium, which houses so many of the institutions of Europe, colonized a part of Africa 80 times its size, the Congo. The Congo is 80 times the size of Belgium. And in Belgium today, you have the International Court of Justice. You have the courts, various European human rights things, and this and that. Europe's reinvention as an arbiter of human rights and freedom of speech is legendary. I mean, somebody needs to write a book, a manual, actually, not a book, but how to launder your image. It's a form of moral laundry, and it did this as part of the Cold War. It said we Europeans, particularly Western Europeans, are the upholders of human rights and freedom, and the East is the behind the Iron Curtain is unfreedom. I mean, it was a Cold War rebranding that was remarkable. And you see the arrogance now of European officials talking about freedom, but what they mean is that they are better people. They have laundered their image, out of the anti-colonial movement, when they were portrayed as colonialists and as oppressors and so on. They did a kind of laundry of their image and came out at the other end saying, we are now distinguished statesmen and we have these long histories of being in favor of transparency and human rights and this, that, and the other. That's their self-image. The practice is very different. I mean, that's the key thing. The practice is very different. Europe and the United States together spend 76% of world military spending. China spends 11%, Russia spends 4% of global military spending. You put the US, Europeans together, that's basically the NATO alliance, 75 to 76% is their share of global annual military spending. They are the largest arms dealers in the world. I mean, look at Sweden. Sweden gives the Peace Prize. Sweden sells us IKEA furniture, but Sweden also sells the Bofors howitzer, a Swedish company. There's a kind of way in which I don't want to answer your question directly because I actually doubt the premise. This genuine siding with Israel, the horror, 6 hostages found dead. My God, that's terrible. Joseph Bostels, the human rights guy from Europe, puts out a tweet. I am horrified, outraged by the death of these 6 hostages. Where is the outrage? Where has he named the name of Osama, 3-year-old boy who was killed along with his birds? Has he named the names of all the doctors who have been killed, tortured in Israeli prisons, and so on? Nothing. Nothing. So I don't take that seriously. I don't take their claims of freedom, human rights, freedom of speech. I don't take any of it seriously because that was merely image laundering. It was public relations. The European project used a very sophisticated, form of public relations to bring the term human rights to them. What human rights? Which human rights? The United States talking about human rights is a joke. I mean, the only country to drop atom bombs and never really, never apologized for it. It never apologized to the Japanese people for dropping atom bombs or for firebombing Dresden The Allies never apologized for the civilian casualties. They just blame the Nazis for everything. I mean, this is not a serious group of people. These are not serious people. Jens Stoltenberg himself is not a serious person. The head of NATO is always some mediocre European politician whose career in their own countries is basically lapsed, and they're sent off to be the lapdogs of the Americans. Some man in an ugly blue suit to run NATO. And look at the character of the people who run the European institutions. Ursula von der Leyen. I mean, it's difficult to take them seriously, honestly. Joseph Postel, you look at their biographies, they are, in fact, institutional people. That's who they are. They are people who emerge out of these institutions. They don't have any imagination about making the world a better place. They can't say things that are interesting. I mean, I would be scared to pick up a book written by the EU commissioner. What arguments would they make? They don't make arguments. They just spout pabulum. They repeat slogans. They are AI generated politicians. These are not serious people. A serious person would have a serious discussion about the perils and calamities that face us. Any serious politician today would ask for a ceasefire in Ukraine. Any serious politician. There has been too much damage in Ukraine already. There needs to be a ceasefire. I don't think the Russians want to absorb all of Ukraine into Russia. I don't think that's their objective. They've already articulated their objectives. The Ukrainians can come to the table and say, no, we won't allow you to keep Mariupol, but we will guarantee water to Crimea. We won't allow you to take Mariupol or the north, but we will guarantee not to join NATO or have no nuclear missiles or whatever. There's a space for negotiation. Zelensky, Vladimir Zelensky, won that election on a peace platform. He came there to make peace with the Russians. He understood Russia is the neighbor. You're going to have peace with them unless you want to live at the situation of North Korea and South Korea, have a demilitarized zone, have a constant state of tension forever. And which means that Europe, including Romania, will never get Russian. Yeah. Every month that goes by, the Russians are going to be building pipelines to take their natural gas to China, to India, to Central Asia, and so on, which means that they are going to be less and less interested in the European market for Russian natural gas. If you don't make a deal now, you're not going to access that natural gas. You're going to have to rely on very expensive liquefied natural gas that comes from the United States. That's a choice Europe can make. Every month that goes by, those pipelines in Asia are being completed. And when they are completed, the Russians are just going to turn around and say, sorry, we are no longer part of Europe. Now we are really just an Asian country. When that happens, Europe is going to suffer in the long term.
This is the end of the first part. Hit the like and subscribe button and stay tuned for the second part.